1. Please be aware the following story contains one incident of suspected animal abuse. We moved a lot when I was a kid, but through high school I always used the same bus stop. It was about a half a block away where our quiet suburban street intersected with a slightly busier one. I was often there alone early in the morning. For the longest time, the most interesting thing that might happen was a raven scolding me from a tree, or that a family of deer would follow me from the park across the street, from my house to the bus stop through the fog, and past me to walk into the forest preserve beyond the intersection. It was a quiet neighborhood, and only a handful of cars might pass by while I waited for the bus. The deer stopped following me after the harassment began. That morning, a Jeep suddenly hit the brakes and slowed to a stop in front of me. The driver had all of the windows rolled down, even though it was a chilly, wet autumn morning, one of those days where the mist just clings to and saturates everything. And the clouds are so low in the sky that you feel like the world is just a big room that you're in. Because of the fog, they hadn't seen me until they were a few meters away, and their braking made a screeching sound. They stopped the car, and the driver just sat there staring straight ahead. I couldn't make them out. They were wearing a light grey hooded sweatshirt and sunglasses. I didn't see anyone else in the car. After about 30 seconds, during which my bemusement gave way to concern that someone was going to hit this guy stopped in the road, he finally turned to me, yelled a racial slur, smiled, and took off. I didn't think too much of it at the time. I was newish to the area. I'm not great with faces, and I figured it was one of the kids at the high school trying to be edgy. Or maybe just a local asshole who had mistaken my ethnic background. Either way, I didn't think about it at all until the next week when it happened again. This time the guy had friends with him. The windows were tinted and they only cracked them so I couldn't see them. He yelled a different slur at me, and I could hear their laughter as they drove off. This continued to happen, sometimes twice in a week, sometimes going months in between. They sounded young, so I continued to write it off as another weird local hazing ritual. But gradually it began to get under my skin. There were two things that bothered me about it. First, the slurs. They were ugly and hateful, and they sounded promisingly violent to me. Even though I felt they could tell that I wasn't a Mexican or an Asian person, or any of the other groups they used slurs for. Second, their license plate was obscured every time. This is a very wealthy area I'm describing, and the local law enforcement wouldn't call out anyone who lived there on a violation. So I wasn't surprised that they got away with it, but it did give me pause. One morning I was ready to yell back at them, but instead of yelling anything, they just swerved at my location on the sidewalk. I jumped out of the way and ran behind a fence, but the Jeep ended up whipping through where I had been standing, before speeding off. I figured the kid had overshot and hadn't actually meant to hurt me. But some of the things that followed have since made me wonder. One morning I came up to the bus stop, and there was just blood all over the area where I usually stood. It was wet for the rain, but otherwise congealing, turning dark in places, but I knew what it was. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was off-putting. A few days later there was a dead animal there, mangled and brutalized. It wasn't roadkill. I couldn't take my eyes off it, even after getting on the bus. It wasn't there when I returned in the afternoon. It wasn't an accident, I feel certain. It looked to me as though it had been stabbed repeatedly. Extreme overkill. I started to see the Jeep outside of the morning bus stop, but the windows were never down now, and it always sped off when you looked at it, or I otherwise couldn't get to it before it left. This carried on for years. One day in the summer I was walking through my neighborhood with a friend, when the Jeep came by at a very high speed, and an egg hit me in the chest. It flowed down my shirt and onto my pants, and all I could think to do was turn to my friend James and say, "You saw that, right?" Because until then nobody else had ever witnessed the events, and my family members seemed skeptical when I mentioned it. I had to go home and change my clothes and take a shower, since the egg hit me at such high speed, that had went to my hair and everywhere. It was then that I started to take the situation more seriously. I had a bruise for weeks. I started to catch a ride with my brother in the mornings, or wait behind the local NFL player's fence until I heard the bus coming down the street. I never did go outside until I had text confirmation that my ride was there. If I heard a car coming on a walk, I would run off into the bushes. They swerved at me a few more times, and then I never saw them again. Some other strange things happened, and I've had stalkers since, but I've never been able to connect them with these events, nor figure out who the people in the Jeep were or where they lived. My parents have moved to a different part of the community now, but I'm still jumpy when I walk around in that area. Creepy Jeep psycho, whoever you are, let's never meet. 2. So this happened fairly recently, a few weeks into my first job, I believe, so that would be around August of 2017. I was heavily asleep that morning when I woke to the sound of my dad panicking and shouting. When I got up, he nervously told us that our house had got broken into. We saw that our front gate — we live in a place wherein it's normal for houses to have tall gates — was still locked, but our front door was wide open. Our front door has 3 locks, one that requires a key and 2 controls to keep the door locked in case the lock gets opened. These 2 are heavy-duty bolt lock that can't be opened by keys, and 1 chain lock that stops the door. On that unfortunate night, however, we forgot to bolt lock the door. Upon checking the house, we saw that nothing was really stolen, except for my dad and little brother's iPhones. We found this really weird because we had MacBooks, cameras, and other expensive gadgets lying around in the living room at that time. After this, we went to check on our CCTV footage. Again, it's normal to have gates and CCTVs in-house here, cause third world country. Since my family sleep fairly early, 10 PM on average, we knew that there was a lot of ground to cover from that time all the way to when we actually woke up. And as we were playing the recordings from that night, we saw that my older brother got home around 1:15 AM, which is also normal since he's a law student, and studies in coffee shops till late at night. Around 10 minutes later, we saw a motorcycle pull up near our gate, and one guy wearing a paper bag on his head climbed our fence. This guy didn't look too scary. He seemed small, very thin, and maybe that's why the first thing he did was walk around our house, to peep in my older brother's window to see if he's asleep. My brother is around 6'2", 240 pounds, so he's huge. After peeking through his window, this guy slowly walked to the front door and picked the lock. When he opened the door, the chain lock I told you about earlier blocked his way, and he brought out a big-ass pair of what seems like chain cutters to cut it down. Once inside our house, all the gadgets in the living room were right there in front of him, but he swiftly made his way to the control box of our CCTV and unplugged it. Luckily, there are 2 sets of cameras, and he didn't get to unplug the other one anymore. With this, he continued to walk straight to my dad and little brother's room — they share rooms — and spent a few minutes there. After a few minutes, we saw the guy briskly walking out of the room while holding a knife. Being in a rush to go out, he accidentally knocked a chair over, and also dropped the knife upon impact. He got up and rushed out without even picking anything up and closing the door. This stunned us. We didn't know what could have happened and what they had in mind given that they had a knife. After watching all of this, we decided to sit down as a family and discuss what just happened. Apparently, when the guy hurried out of my dad's room, my dad remembers hearing our cat growl really hard. Maybe that scared the guy. Dad didn't bother to get up because our cat does that a lot whenever there are house bugs or whatever at night. And when we talked, my older brother said he felt uneasy that night when he was about to sleep. He felt like he was being watched, which is proven to be true because of the footage we had. Further, we believe that it was premeditated, and they had a specific goal, and that they have been surveilling us for a while. I mean, they knew what time my brother gets home usually. They also knew exactly where my dad's room was. They also know where the CCTV control box is. They also happen to know that this night was the only night when we let our 4 German shepherds sleep in their cages at the far end of our backyard, when they usually sleep free and let loose in the front yard by the front door. It just seemed like they knew too much. We have 2 guesses as to who this could be, but we just couldn't figure it out completely. One, it could have been a former maid we had, and had fired because we caught her and her husband stealing stuff at home. Explains how they knew exactly where everything was located at home, as well as our schedule. It was weird though, cause if it were them, we thought they'd go for the other items in the house and sell it for money or something. But instead they went straight to my dad's room with a knife. Were they planning to murder, cause the maid got fired? 2. It could have been these guys my little brother and I got into an altercation with in a sketchy cell phone repair store. These 2 guys we had an altercation with were tough guys. They agreed to fix my brother's phone for a certain price, and we had a deal to get it done by a certain date. What happened was they accidentally broke my brother's phone while trying to fix it, and wanted my brother to still pay for the parts. Being a defensive brother and an MMA fighter, I knew I had to step up. We got into a heated argument, and one of the guys was saying things like, "Ayoko ng gulo, kakalangan ko lang sa church dahil sa mga kasalanan ko." Which translates to, I don't want to fight. I just went to church to ask for forgiveness for my sins. And he said it in a threatening manner. At the end of the day, though, my dad, having a lot of connections, was able to make these 2 give my little brother a replacement phone that's actually better than the one he got fixed in the first place. Could it be that they wanted the phone back and wanted revenge? We were thinking that this is possible too, because they could have found our address from the phone my little brother originally got fixed. And it also makes sense that they know how to deactivate people's IDs so quickly. We decided to try to use Find My Phone on the 2 stolen phones, but to our surprise, the Apple IDs won't work anymore. To our surprise, when my dad and brother checked their emails, they received a notification saying that they have successfully deactivated their Apple IDs, or something like that, at around 1:40 in the morning. The CCTV footage showed that the 2 guys in the motorcycle left around 1:27 a.m. Totally weird, huh? When we contacted the police to give our statement, they really weren't of help. We did, however, get better security measures at home. And also after that, nothing ever happened anymore, so at least we have that. But to this day, the image of a man with a paper bag mask, looking straight into the CCTV camera, still gives me chills. So to the paper bag masked man who broke into our house with a knife, let's not meet again, ever. 3. For some context, this happened to my younger brother Stephen and I when we were 9 and 6 in our neighborhood just outside a major city in Alaska. Our neighborhood had a 4-way stop right in the middle, 3 ways leading into different residential areas, and the main straightway coming from a busy roadway. It was about 7 p.m. in late November, around Thanksgiving. My mom was going to volunteer at our local soup kitchen and invited us along. We were psyched, and asked if we could invite our friend Tucker that lived down the street, and she agreed. She told us that she would drive us down in a few minutes, but we begged to walk so we could play in the snow. She reluctantly agreed, but we had to get a ride back to the house from Tucker's mom, as it was getting dark quickly. We pulled on our snow gear as fast as we could and set off on the half-mile walk to Tucker's house. To get there, we had to approach the 4-way stop and take a right onto the main straightway down the side that leads deeper into the neighborhood. If someone was driving down the main road and looked down the straightway, we would easily be seen, especially since we were walking under the streetlights on the shoulder of the road. The walk started off just fine. Stephen and I were kicking up snow and shrieking when the falling flakes would land on our faces. We were about halfway to Tucker's house when we heard a car rumbling along the road behind us. We paused our game and scooted over to the next berm of snow, piled onto the side of the road to give the car plenty of space to pass. I remember it being an old, rusty brown car that resembled a Cadillac. May have been, I don't quite remember. The windows were completely blacked out, and we just stared as it slowly rolled past us and turned left a few streets down from where we were on the straightway. Stephen and I went back to kicking snow at each other every few steps, and after a few minutes we heard a familiar rumble coming towards us. The same brown car was idling at a stop sign, coming out of the street it had just turned down. Stephen grabbed the sleeve of my jacket and pulled me back towards the berm under the streetlights. My 9-year-old mind figured they were just lost and this was a confusing neighborhood, and they probably missed the correct street. They rolled past us heading back towards the main road, and we smiled and waved at them, our way of wishing them well. We watched them inch up the road and turn down on the side streets, at the 4-way stop instead. We shrugged and kept walking. It was starting to get very dark at this point, and we were picking up our pace to get to Tucker's house before it got too dark. There were only streetlights on the side of the road we were on. Strange, I know. It was a weird neighborhood in a poor part of town, and we were both afraid of the dark. We were about 3 streets away from Tucker's Road when we hear an all too familiar rumble approach us from behind. "It's that car again," Stephen whispered to me, as he gripped my hand as hard as his thick mittens would allow. I tugged him forward and ignored the car. It rumbled alongside us for a few seconds before screeching to a very slow halt. The passenger side window rolled down, and a man stuck his head out of the window. He was very clean despite his clunky ride. He called out to us as we were walking. "Where are you kiddos going? It's too cold to be walking, let me give you a ride." Stephen gripped my hand even tighter, and we both trudged on, not looking back to acknowledge him. Our mother had drilled it deep into us that we were never to talk to strangers, especially in our town. "Come on, it's really warm in here. I'll take you for a steamer and then take you home." Steamed milk and flavoring, like coffee huts, but just for steamers. He repeatedly offered us a ride, and each time we trudged on without a word. After about 3 minutes he rolled up his window and then drove away, making another left on the street right before Tucker's. Alarm bells were screaming in my head, because I knew grown men shouldn't be offering rides to kids they don't know. I turned to Stephen and told him that we were going to cross the street to the side without lights, and if we saw the car again, we were going to climb over the snow berm into the deep snow on the other side and hide. This was somehow more logical to 9-year-old me than booking it to Tucker's house, but still, I was 9. Stephen agreed, and we crossed. We heard the car before we saw it. I turned to Stephen and told him that he needed to jump with me. He was crying, and said that he didn't want to, and I promised him that I would hold his hand, and he agreed. We climbed over the berm onto the other side and sunk down about 2 feet into the snow. The berm itself was about 4 feet tall, so there was no way we'd be seen unless someone climbed up onto the berm itself and looked down. We sat huddled together in the snow, holding back tears, as we heard the rumbling grow closer. It idled for a few seconds at what was possibly a stop sign, and then it grew louder. Now, during the winter, there are big gravel trucks that come through roads in big residential areas like ours, and spit gravel all over the roads since they're solid ice to aid in traction. The roads had been freshly gravelled about an hour before we left the house, so there was no way to see our prints in the road. The berm was almost entirely frozen, having been there for a month already. That, paired with us being very light kids, meant that there was no way that they could have seen where we crossed or climbed the berm, especially when we crossed the street to the unlit side. The car rolled to a stop and idled just up the street from our hiding place for a few minutes. We could faintly hear 2 male voices yelling at each other inside the car. We heard a window roll down, but nobody said anything, just silence. I think that they were listening for us. After a few minutes, we heard another car coming down the road, and a man say, "Shit!" and the brown beater sped away. We heard the second car pass, but stayed where we were crying silent tears, because we were afraid that the car would come back. After about 15 minutes, we couldn't bear the cold anymore, so we started to dig ourselves out of the snow and climb up the berm. There wasn't a car in sight, so we ran as fast as we could on the icy road down the last street, straight to Tucker's door. We knocked, and Tucker's mother whipped the door open and ushered us inside. Apparently our mom called her, asking if we'd made it yet, and when Tucker's mom said we hadn't, our mom began patrolling the streets looking for us. It was probably her car that we heard approaching that scared the men away. We were choking back tears and clinging to each other, asking for our mom over and over. Tucker's mother called our mom to let her know we'd made it, and within minutes our mom was at the door. We ran into her arms and started wailing about the men in the car and hiding in the snow. My mom called the police, but they never came. She later told me it was because the men hadn't threatened or touched us, so there was nothing they could do. High crime rate in our town. I guess they had bigger fish to fry. We weren't allowed out alone after dark after that. And later that year, we had saved enough money to move to a safer town. Creepy man in the brown beater. Let's not meet. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories, episode 298. This time next week, you'll be listening to episode 300. Unless you choose to not listen to it on a Monday and delay it to another day, in which case you'll hear it later. I'd actually miscalculated a little bit. I thought it would be Wednesday I'd have to get it ready for, but it turns out I've got another week to get it done, which is good, because the more time I have to do it, the better it turns out. Okay, and with that, I think I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.